Hey, welcome back, everyone. We're sitting here with Hoon Kim, Director of the Captive Nations Coalition of the Committee on Present-Endangered China. We're going to be talking about the Chinese Communist Party's abusive policies towards other countries. Hoon Kim, it's a real pleasure having you on Crossroads.
Thank you.
Now, you've been working on this coalition of these captive peoples of China. Tell us how this works or what you're working on.
So the Captive Nations Coalition, or the CNC, as with its own acronym, it's made up of folks that have been taken over and were specifically oppressed by the Chinese Communist Party over the last 70 years, I would say, since its founding. So we represent those who are in the United States as well as those who are outside of the United States, trying to get their voices heard to the international world.
Now, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo actually tweeted out a photo with some of you folks on there talking about this, actually. And it was interesting to see because this is a very different way of presenting the human rights abuses of the Chinese Communist Party, because we know that they invaded Tibet and they invaded Hong Kong now as well.
Right.
And they invaded, for example, southern Mongolia, Inner Mongolia. And we see now that these are kind of isolated incidents. The idea of uniting them under one issue is a very unique stance. Now, I'm curious, how did this coalition come together?
Well, the coalition came together, I would say, since the foundation of the CCP itself. It never was really united, to a point that it is today strategically. And what I mean by strategically is that, since we have this blessings of technology and the fact that there is a closer community awareness now, for example, with what's happening to the people of East Turkestan, or what is known as the Uyghur issue, people are becoming a lot more aware in that regard. So in terms of the general awareness, in terms of the general information that's out there, these communities are a lot more united than ever before, and they have the need to do that. Every single one of these communities have now come to realize that if we do not unite and do something in order to get our voices heard, we are going to be silenced forever. So with all of that together is how this coalition came about. And the Committee on Present-Endangered China decided this is the platform that we need to provide to the folks from these captive nations so that not only their voices can be heard, but a realistic action can be taken in order to ensure that there is true freedom that they'll be enjoyed in the future. So,
now, when you met with Pompeo, what was the message you presented to him on this group?
So, Secretary Pompeo, first and foremost, was extremely sympathetic. He was also extremely very, very genuine about just meeting each and every single one of us. I was actually inspired. Also, I was also very happy, extremely happy that he took the time to hear from each and every single member of the Captive Nations group. So we had a representative from Tibet, East Turkestan, Southern Mongolia, and another gentleman who represented Kazakhstan, which is a huge Belt and Road Initiative project nation by the Chinese Communist Party, and is one of the most important countries in order for that initiative to come into fruition into the future. So we presented all these cases in terms of why this needs critical attention and why this is important to the United States and really to the rest of the world. He listened very, very carefully, and he also said this is something that is much needed. And he said to us that this is an initiative that is extremely important for all of us. And I interpreted that as something that is important to every single one of us, not only in the United States, but to the rest of the world. So that's at least the gist of the message that we received from Secretary Pompeo. And I would even say it's the most important thing to a certain degree.
I'm curious, when it comes to the CCP, its agendas, and what this represents, you said this is the most important issue with China right now, one of the most important. And it's something important for the world as well. Why do you say it's important for the world, this issue?
Well, it is important for the world because, one of the things that the CCP does historically, they have done, I should say, is that every single place that they have taken over, per se, other than different parts of China. And I would even add that the Chinese people have been the first victims of the Chinese Communist Party. After they were done with them, they moved on to take over these other nations that were once independent and free. And they have tested out their oppression. Specifically, we see today slave labor, which is rampant, and which has unfortunately have driven the Chinese economy for a very, very long time. It's still going on today. And what is happening to the Uyghurs, for example, and Kazakhs and all the other Turkic people in what is known as Xinjiang. The mass surveillance system, for example, that's being exported all over the world. So if you look at it from that degree, you can't help but to wonder, is this going to reach our shores one day? And is this going to be affecting me and my family one day? And what will be the consequences that we have to pay at that time? And it scares you. And it scares you because all of these things that we thought were once a foreign issue will become a reality for us one day. So that is why I say it's one of the most important things, because this is a threat to literally every single one of us right now. And one of the things that the Captive Nations Coalition aims to do is to also provide a voice to all those individuals from the Belt and Road Initiative countries. As you know, the Belt and Road Initiative is what is known as a neo-colonialism effort by the CCP. And once they take over these areas after a series of episodes of countries not being able to pay back these massive loans that the CCP has given to them, or a takeover of a land because of a historical claim, like what's happening in Tajikistan, for example, right now. It serves as an example a lot more at that time, because now we see their expansion becoming a reality to sovereign nations. So by engaging with the captive nations, we want to also let the world know that as these countries were taken over in the past, when they were once free and independent, this could become a reality for all countries in the globe, and that is pretty scary. And that's really the message that has been driving us till this day.
And this isn't far-fetched either. We know the Chinese Communist Party uses its abuses in, for example, Xinjiang, also called East Turkestan, as the testing ground for different types of authoritarian monitoring or other practices to keep the populations under control. And when they work there, they replicate them in other parts of China. And we also know, as you mentioned, when the Chinese Communist Party goes abroad and makes these business deals under the One Belt, One Road initiative, these technologies come within the package of that when they build the infrastructure. The idea that the Chinese Communist Party is spreading its model of government using East Turkestan or Xinjiang as one of the models, for example, of that type of oppressive government, and encouraging other governments in the world to follow that model. This really is an interesting point. It really is an image of the CCP creating its own system around the world. And maybe the front line of battle of this is these nations standing up against that and pushing back. Is this how you're viewing it? You mentioned this is one of the most important issues, that this is kind of like the drawing of the line in these countries themselves. Is this accurate?
Absolutely. And on top of that, I would even say that a large portion of the Captive Nations Coalition communities, whether they're Tibetans, Southern Mongolians, East Turkestanis, specifically Uyghurs and Kazakhs, or even just ordinary Chinese dissidents who are Falun Gong practitioners, Chinese Christians, or just individuals who just simply want democracy. Many of them are patriotic, not just towards the United States, but patriotic members of a free society. And to them, that's a really, really critical part in the continuation of their survival too. Because not only are they fighting for their own freedom, but they're also warning the world about what could come, what could become a reality, as it did for them. But also at the same time, they teach us, every single one of these folks at least have taught me and many, many people in the committee and elsewhere how important and how valuable the freedom that exists here in the United States and the rest of the free world. And in a way, the Captive Nations Coalition, aims to spread that message to each and every one of us that, it doesn't matter what you are, it doesn't matter what political party you affiliate yourself with. At the end of the day, we're still part of this free society. And there are those who are telling us that this is an important part of humanity and that we must do everything that we can to protect the freedoms that we have in this country.
Now, I know you work, of course, very closely with these people and the stories they're telling from within their own countries. And for a lot of people, I think people care about it, but for a lot of people, it's very distant. What is the situation like on the ground in these countries based on the people you've spoken to?
Well, it's much worse than the narrative that we get from the general media. Fortunately, there are many investigative journalists like yourselves and many others around the world that have done their best to report on some of the oppression that goes on. When we talk about Tibet, right, you have mass surveillance, mass military presence, which is the same as East Turkestan or otherwise known as Xinjiang. You hear from the Mongolian communities. For the first time, Mongolian people from all over the world have spoken out in unison against the Chinese Communist Party and what they're doing to the Mongol language and just identity. I mean, to them, this is a clear attempt to exterminate the Mongolian culture. And at least with the information that is being provided to these communities from the folks on the ground, people are saying, times what you know by 10. And that's how bad it is. They said, every morning we wake up and we're wondering, is this the day that I'm going to get arrested for speaking out against government policies that are trying to destroy people like me? You hear from those from Xinjiang or East Turkestan. They say they say the simple words, is my mother or father alive? My sisters are in concentration camp. I wonder if they're still breathing. So that's sort of, unfortunately, the gist of the stuff that we hear, right? And that's a gist of the truth that goes on, in these captive areas. When you talk to the folks from the Belt and Road Initiative nations like Nigeria or Kazakhstan or even Nepal, for example, one term always comes up, which is the term sovereignty. They say we are losing our sovereignty. Why? Because when the CCP actually demonstrate what they can do through these Belt and Road Initiative, project, they bring their own workers into their country. They don't hire any of the local workforce that's available there. Plus, they know for a fact that their government is corrupt, and henceforth will do anything that the CCP tells them in the future, as they have been doing right now. And so, consequently, what would happen is the people will have to be the ones paying the price for it. They won't be able to get jobs, and since there's pretty much a Chinese takeover of their ports, of their military bases, and even a large portion of their energy sectors, like it was in Sri Lanka, the people are wondering, well, we're Sri Lankans, we're Nepalis, we're Kazakhs, we're Nigerians, we're X, Y, and Z. Are we not going to be able to call ourselves that anymore? And there's a genuine fear among these communities of losing who they are eventually in the future, all in the name of prosperous friendship that the CCP offers. So it's a lot more troubling than we know, and it's a lot more troubling than we could ever imagine at this point. And that's why it's so critical that we at least start doing our research on these world communities right now.
I've actually spoken, of course, at different events and so on, and sometimes I get Chinese people, CCP type people coming up to me and saying, "Oh, how dare you criticize the Chinese Communist Party?" And one of the narratives they'll say is, didn't America invade Iraq? as an excuse of why the CCP invaded, for example, Tibet.
Right.
And, didn't America have colonialism? Didn't the West? Why can't the Chinese Communist Party have it? They try to create this equivalency,
Right.
of course, in their narratives. What would you say to that?
Well, look, the United States and rest of the rest of the free world isn't innocent, isn't perfect. China's not perfect, right? And we clearly realize that. But the difference between not just the United States itself, but the difference between the free world and the Chinese Communist Party run China is that in the free world, at least we can hold ourselves accountable. For example, the Japanese internment, that was wrong. Slavery, that was wrong. But I can say that it is wrong because systematically I was taught about what had happened. And my teachers, I remember my fourth grade teacher, giving us a book assignment on the Japanese internment camps, and said, these were human beings, American citizens, many of them patriotic American citizens that were taken away in these internment camps, and we have to make sure that something like this never repeats again. You have that kind of accountability system, and thank God we do, right? And the Iraq War, look, a lot of people have given their analysis to it, right? And now a lot of us realize that there was a lot more troubling factors about it than we realized in the past, right? But why do we have that system? Why do we have an opportunity to say that something was wrong and something was not wrong? It's because we have a system where we can at least correct ourselves, and that is how democracy runs, because human beings are inherently imperfect. Now let's look at a system run by the Chinese Communist Party. Do you also notice how every single one of their arguments have a reason behind it? Well, we invaded Tibet, they'll say, because it was a feudal system that was run by some Lama dictatorship, and we freed them. They'll have the same arguments for Southern Mongolia and what they began to call Xinjiang or East Turkestan. They said these people were backwards, these people were uneducated, but we went in there and saved the day. That sounds a lot like the KKK, for example, saying, well, gosh darn, we brought these minorities, we gave them education, we gave them all these great benefits in this country, and that's why everyone's enjoying what they're enjoying today. When in reality, it doesn't matter what race or background you're from. As Americans, we have the ability to build a better world here by holding ourselves accountable always. But for the Chinese Communist Party, I have not seen a single factor where that was applied in their system. And so that would be the narrative that I would provide. And that is probably the best narrative that these CCP sympathizers can hear. But also at the same time, I'm sure a lot of the programs that you've done in the past were done in the United States. Strangely enough, however imperfect this system is, they sure love to come over here, right, and enjoy a lot of the benefits that we have, right? I mean, if someone hits them, I'm sure they'll take it up to our court system, right, to rectify it, as they should. So, and it's a lot more sinister, too, because one of the things that the CCP does is that it has an inherent need to convince the world that at the end of the day, they are supreme. They are above everyone else. And unfortunately, you see a lot of Han supremacism in that as well. And that's the reason why, and strangely enough, this is actually imposed upon the people of Hong Kong as well, and towards the people of Taiwan as well, right? It's like, well, we are the dominant people, and so we will do our best to, correct all mistakes, all sorts of problems in your land, right? When, if you look at it, a lot of Han Chinese people aren't sympathetic to what their government are saying, right? So that's another sinister part behind the CCP, because they would, just because of what makes up their background, right? They'll use that, they'll weaponize it in order to justify their crimes. When the rest of the country knows that it's bad, but they can't say anything. So I would say those are the biggest systematic differences. And thank God, I'm living in a free world where I can look at something and say that is wrong. and I can teach my children to make sure that they don't make the same mistakes as I do.
Now, I know one of the narratives I've heard tossed around, and including, in fact, by even some Western journalists and academics, is they say, oh, well, China uplifted the Chinese people out of poverty.
Right.
Right. Now, I've personally responded to that, and I said, no, they suppressed the Chinese people. China was, of course, coming out of coming out of a feudalist society,
Right.
As was most of the world in the early 1900s and late 1800s. The CCP tries to take credit for the bringing about of technology. Like, no, that was a product of Western capitalism.
Right.
That was brought into China.
Right. Exactly. Right.
But of course, but they try to say, the Chinese Communist Party says there'd be no new China without the CCP. That's one of their slogans. And I've been shocked to see how many Western academics and journalists pick that up and actually believe it.
Sure.
I'm curious, though, based on, because I know you've spoken to those people as well, how do you often explain that? How do you talk about that?
Well, firstly, in terms of prosperity, we need to define what prosperity means. Does prosperity just mean money? And in that case, yeah, China would technically fall under that, successful nation. But that's really not the reality, is it? Right? The wealth of China, I'm sure the CCP had a role in it, but in a genuine sense, it was the Chinese people that made it into a reality. Right? When you have an open market system, human beings, no matter what you are, will take advantage of that, right, to make yourself grow, individual growth, as some may call it, right? That concept was transported into China, and the Chinese people said, you know what, I'm going to take part in that. And a large portion of the Chinese economy grew because of the Chinese people doing that, not because some government official in the CCP, giving them all the directives on what to do. One thing that Deng Xiaoping did well is not doing anything. He didn't do anything. He just let the economy grow, right? But now, let's look at it from the present context, right? The CCP knew that this growth was going to happen, and then they said, one of the CCP does well is figuring out how they can actually have a say or have a complete control over it. And even though they call themselves proud, quote unquote, communists, a lot of these party members, especially those on the top, have huge shares and presence in these markets. So going back to these academics, right? Unfortunately, we had academic freedom, independence in this country up until, I would say, maybe even 10 years ago. But when universities started to rely heavily on the Chinese students' tuitions, and I would even say there's also a factor of cancel culture where professors want to just pretty much criticize the U.S. as much as possible, but also at the same time interpret that as, well, in order to do that successfully, I need to praise a system that's other than the United States. I personally have seen that on some of the professors that I've had in the past. They would praise the Chinese Communist Party, they would even say, well, despite the human rights conditions, they've done so well, and they have a system that doesn't have a capitalist founding. So we support them, in a sense, right? But they said, well, when it comes to human rights, well, we can talk about that later. It's terrible, but that's every country has a bad human rights record. So they'll be extremely dismissive of it, right? So my answer to those individuals who call themselves academics would say, well, Chinese government has done a great job in terms of bringing their people out of the poverty. Well, that's a lot more degrading to the Chinese people than ever, because what you're essentially saying is the Chinese people, at least to me, it sounds like Chinese people are somehow unable to take advantage of a free market like we do, right? It's at the end of the day, it was all the government effort that made it all possible. And we know that it's not true. And I would even go as far as to say this, is that, this narrative about, the Chinese people being another Chinaman, I would even say, it's extremely degrading. In a way, it's alive today in the Western world. Many people would not realize it, but they're in that pool. And stuff like that, by saying that, like, well, the Chinese people are different. The CCP has done at least a good job in bringing them out of the poverties that they were living in. I mean, well, are you basically saying that the Chinese people are not good enough for democracy? They are. Many of them come to the United States and have become amazing democratic figures, and have become amazing members of society that I and many of us come to respect. So, I would even say this is the time to keep ourselves and hold ourselves to a higher degree, and accept the fact that the Chinese people, are equal to all of us, and they deserve equal treatment as every single one of us on this planet. So, and I would even say, unless we do away with such narrative, we will never ever be able to address the threat that we're facing from the CCP completely.
I guess just last question. In terms of your coalition, based on what could happen, and based on why you do the work you're doing, if you were to tell people one thing about the importance of this kind of drawing the line with the CCP,
Sure.
and what is at risk in terms of that as well if it fails, what would you tell them?
Well, failure to me is not an option. But if it does happen, I think all of us would agree that the least that we want to do is to tell each other that at least we gave it our best. But the sad part about your question is that could only happen if the world does not wake up to the threats of the CCP. And at the end of the day, it's up to the individuals in this country to firstly come to awareness of that threat and act in accordance to what they think is the most appropriate thing to do, and in the best of their abilities. And I think at this point, I can clearly tell you that since its founding, the Captive Nations Coalition has been made up of individuals that pretty much have said to themselves, I'm not going to quit until my family is free from the concentration camps. I'm not going to quit until my culture is protected. I'm not going to quit until someone that's the Dalai Lama could return to Tibet, and see himself as the leader of the Tibetan people. So as long as that determination is alive, I don't think defeat will ever really happen. Even just mentioning the Chinese people themselves, this flaming fire for freedom and democracy that many of dissidents and just even the rest of the Chinese people who genuinely want it, defeat will not come as long as that fire is alive. And that has been demonstrated throughout the years since the founding of the CCP. I mean, look at what the Falun Gong practitioners are doing, for example, right? Let's set aside everything for a second. Despite the limited resources, despite the attacks that they're getting constantly as an evil cult or some other vilifying terms, they've done an amazing job in terms of protecting who they are, but also going beyond that and saying that China can be better, and that we need to let the world know that the CCP is an evil monster. The Chinese Christians, they're paying their price, with arrests, torture, a lot of times executions, organ harvesting, Despite all that, the Chinese people and the members of these captive nations have put up a fight. So I don't think any of them are looking into defeat, but the more that this fire is raging on, the closer to victory we are. And that's our primary focus, so that one day the restoration of their independence and freedom can be achieved. And as long as that is also alive, the term defeat will never apply to any of them. I can assure you of that.
Hoon Kim, thanks for being on the show, and thanks for doing what you're doing.
Thank you.